What's up, Tailgaters? You're in the booth with Tailgate Nate today. Welcome to my channel and welcome to my Week 11 takeaways. We're going to tell you everything I learned about this year's college football teams, this year's college football season, this past Saturday. Got a little taste of the chaos on November 2nd, but last Saturday, a lot of the big dogs started to fall, and there's a lot of chaos that still may and probably will take place the rest of this crucial month in the college football season. Before we dive on into this video, I do want to say apologies for not getting this video out yesterday like I wanted to. One of my PowerPoints actually got corrupted, and I had to remake my entire graphics. You might see my preview prediction. Things look a little bit different because I'm going to have to remake that template that I made, but yeah, really annoying thing that happened, but we remade everything. We're back doing this one here for you. And we're ready to tell you what I learned about Week 11 of the college football season. You will see my top 25 out today, but then my college football playoff predictions will not be out until tomorrow. Because again, I have to remake those graphics, but also little bit of thinking that I still have left to do on that. But let me tell you what I learned from this past weekend of college football. Make sure if you guys aren't already, hit the subscribe button, ring the bell, and continue to support the channel in any way you can. Obviously, subscribing being the biggest one, but if you're just simply sitting down, taking 15 to 20 minutes out of your day to watch this video and enjoy it, I really do appreciate that. But you can also like, you can comment, you can share, and if you want to support me in any other way, you can go give me a follow on Twitter or X. It's at TailgateNate29. Again, starting to figure out how I want to post a little bit more. Hopefully by next week, I start to have a lot better of an idea, and hopefully there are going to be some consistent things going out there on Twitter, again, at TailgateNate29. Please go follow me, but without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I give you the chaos of November because this is my first takeaway. Now, I know these are two of the more minor upsets that I have pictured on the screen. It's because we're going to talk about some of the bigger ones later in this video, but this is the college football chaos that we absolutely love to see, and especially in the month of November, first year of the 12-team playoff field. I mean, stop. We are getting absolutely spoiled this season. Again, we got a little taste of the chaos on November 2nd. Duke almost beat Miami, but Miami was able to survive. And again, a couple other of minor things. I mean, you had Minnesota go on the road and beat the Illinois Fighting Illini. Michigan gave Oregon a little test. Florida gave Georgia a little test. And then, I mean, we did see some pretty big upsets there that week, though. Texas Tech went on the road and beat Iowa State. You had South Carolina take down the top 10 team in Texas A&M, and then Louisville on the road beating Clemson. Probably the most shocking loss that happened last week. But then this week, we're going to talk about some of these later, but number 3, Georgia losing to Ole Miss. Number 4, Miami losing to Georgia Tech. You had Indiana almost go down at the hands of the Michigan Wolverines, but they were able to survive. You had Clemson survive. You had Colorado survive. Alabama beat the brakes off of LSU. And then these two that you see pictured right here, Virginia going on the road and beating a Pitt team that, well, sometimes you see this happen in college football where a team that starts out undefeated, you don't necessarily expect to be in that position. They lose one game, and then everything just kind of starts to unravel. That's what I think is happening with Pitt this season, and it's kind of what's happening with Iowa State too, because, hey, they just went ahead and lost to Kansas. Exact same scenario. Two teams that, I mean, in some people's eyes were thought to be good coming into this year. They were undefeated entering last week, not this week. They were undefeated entering last week, and now 2 straight losses. You're starting to see the things unravel. Pitt and Iowa State probably at this point out of playoff contention, or at the very least, it would take a lot for them to get into the college football playoff. But again, these were two of the more minor upsets that we saw. We're going to dive on into the Ole Miss one later. We're going to dive on into the Georgia Tech one later, as well as a couple other performances from around the nation. But guys, I want to talk about the Big Ten for just a little bit. I mentioned Indiana earlier in this video, and the fact that they barely were able to get by the Michigan Wolverines. Now, I say barely. They were controlling that game. Michigan made a push. They decided to go for 2 to try to tie the game. Didn't work out. Indiana got a field goal to sort of pad the lead, make Michigan need a touchdown. Special teams stepped up. Defense stepped up, and the Indiana Hoosiers move to their first ever double-digit win season, and there are still 2 games left to go, guys. That is the Curt Cignetti effect. He's been a mastermind everywhere he has made a stop in the world of college football, Indiana being no exception to that right now. But I believe the Big Ten might already have some playoff locks, because if you take a look at these 3 teams on screen, obviously Oregon, the number 1 team in the country right now, one of very few undefeated teams left, and they are without a shadow of a doubt the best team in college football right now, at least in terms of who is most deserving of that number one overall ranking. It is the Oregon Ducks, and it's not even close. When you go ahead and you take a look at the other two teams here, when you take a look at Ohio State and Penn State, obviously Ohio State's only loss is to the Oregon Ducks, the team that's at number one. That's why the playoff committee put Ohio State at number two. And Penn State's only loss is to the Ohio State Buckeyes. And all three of these teams took care of business last week. Ohio State demolishing Purdue, Penn State taking care of business in the whiteout game against Washington, and Oregon, after some early struggles, able to really push by the Maryland Terrapins, winning that game by 21 points. I think all three of these teams are playoff locks. Just in general, unless there is some extraterrestrial chaos that happens, unless there's just this super unpredictable upset. Like at this point, I don't think Northwestern or Michigan are going to beat the Ohio State Buckeyes. Oregon is, I believe, is on a bye week this week. No, they are not on a bye week this week. On a bye week next week, they go on the road to play Wisconsin. I mean, that one could definitely be a trap game for them. But I think even if they lose that game, they're going to be fine. Then they have Washington. I don't see the Huskies beating them, especially if they couldn't even come close to beating the Penn State Nittany Lions. And then when you take a look at what Penn State has the rest of the way, maybe the road game against Minnesota, probably watch out for that one. But otherwise, Penn State's got a pretty easy road the rest of the way. No matter what two teams make the Big Ten championship, both of those teams are going to get into the college football playoff. And the only reason that I don't say Indiana is a playoff lock as of now is because if they lose that game to Ohio State and they get absolutely blown out, if they just get the brakes beat off of them in Columbus, which I don't think is going to happen, by the way, but if that were to be the case, and Ohio State just absolutely makes a bold statement and hammers Indiana into the ground, Indiana will not have the resume to compete with some of the two-loss teams that are going to come out of the SEC. And we will be talking about that later because the SEC could be very chaotic and the doomsday scenario starting to take place. But I believe, guys, no matter what way you slice it, even if Ohio State or let's say in whatever reality Penn State were to lose a second game this season, I don't think it's going to keep them out of the college football playoff. I mean, if Ohio State loses to the Indiana Hoosiers, well, then Indiana's going to go on to the Big Ten championship game, and then the Big Ten has 4 playoff locks right there. If Indiana beats Ohio State, I could confidently say I think all 4 of those top teams in the Big Ten Conference are going to wind up getting a spot in the college football playoff. The one wild card right now is Indiana. I think they have a really, really, really good shot to get in, even if they do lose that game to Ohio State in Columbus, because that's a road loss to the toughest team they've played all year, yada, yada, yada. But right now, I find it very hard to believe that either one of these 3 teams, any one of these 3 teams, will miss out on the college football playoff. I think in some way, shape, or form, one of these 2 teams will get a first-round bye. More than likely, it'll be either Ohio State or Oregon, as that right now probably going to end up being the Big Ten championship game if all the favorites were to win out. And, of course, that means Ohio State beating Indiana here in just a couple of weeks. But I would be very hard-pressed for you to give me a scenario unless some upset chaos magic happens to where any one of these 3 teams misses out on the college football playoff. Indiana might very well be included in that. But again, if they get blown out in Columbus, then you have to start to compare resumes. And in a lot of ways, that probably will not be in Indiana's favor. So that one remains to be seen to me. But I'm still pretty confident on the Hoosiers' abilities to make the college football playoff. So let's go ahead and move on now. Let's talk about the Big 12 for just a little bit here. The Big 12 now with Iowa State's loss, that very well might also be a one-bid conference, and we'll talk about a one-bid conference here in just a little bit. But BYU, I had talked about it in so many videos previously. Miami had been the team epitome of surviving and advancing this season. They had survived in so many games. It caught up with them last week, and we'll talk about that one here on the next slide. But BYU, they had to do their first survive and advance test, because when you take a look at what BYU's schedule had looked like up to that point, like, sure, there was a survive and advance test against Oklahoma State. Okay, sure. So maybe not their first one, but they had to get that one out of the way. Otherwise, though, there really was no survive and advance test. I'm not really going to say that game against SMU was a survive and advance game because they were really controlling that game when it was early in the season. We didn't know what both of those teams were going to be up until that point, but you had 4th and 10 twice. You run one play kind of because no one could hear the timeout whistle. It was so loud in that building. And then you get the benefit of a holding call, which if you want my opinion on that, you got to let the receiver break out, out of his route the way the officials were calling that game, though. Do you throw that flag? Do you not? I think it's a really 50-50 ticky-tack call, but what happened is it went in BYU's favor. Utah had their chances to get that stop. They couldn't do it. BYU goes down the field, kicks a game-winning field goal, and they move on to 9-0. Now, firmly in the driver's seat of the Big 12 Conference, because I don't think to what Colorado has done this year, they match up to it. Now, again, BYU's got some landmines left. You have a game against Kansas this week. They're coming off an upset win against the Iowa State Cyclones, and the Jayhawks have lost a lot of close one-possession games this season. They're going to start to take advantage of that, especially now coming off of that upset win against Iowa State, and that very well might push Iowa State out of Big 12 championship game contention. Kansas State is going to need some things to go right, and that includes Colorado losing another game here. BYU's also got a road game against the Arizona State Sun Devils, and you can't discount what Arizona State has done so far this year, but you take a look at Colorado. They got Utah coming up this week. I don't think that's going to be a big landmine, but they also have a game against Kansas. They have to go on the road to play that game. But it's time to start seriously talking about what Dion and this Colorado team are doing, because Travis Hunter is one of the best playmakers in college football right now. Sanders at the quarterback has been phenomenal all season long. And, I mean, you take a look at this offensive line. Yeah, it's still allowing too many sacks short. It's allowed 29 sacks this year, 28 of them to the Shedeur. The defensive front, though, they're improving. 29 sacks this year, that's a really good number. The offensive line, it's a whole lot better than what it was last season. The trench play is improving. The run game, okay, they maybe still do not have a great run game, and I still think there would need to be some things that go Colorado's way for them to get into the college football playoff, or at least for them to be a true contender within the college football playoff. But, guys, you look at everything right now. Everything is in front of Coach Prime. Everything is in front of this Colorado team. It's time to start taking the Buffs seriously. They are a college football playoff threat. They are a Big 12 threat, especially if they take care of business the rest of the way in the regular season. They're going to wind up in Arlington in the Big 12 championship game, likely against this BYU team, because there is some wiggle room for BYU. Only undefeated team left in conference, one of very few undefeated teams left in the nation. They can afford a loss, and they'd still be able to get into Arlington in a Big 12 championship game. Obviously, they want to go undefeated and win every game, but they got some landmines left, and they can afford one loss here. Let's move on now to talk about the ACC. The ACC now likely a one-bid league because, well, the survive and advance mentality of Miami was not strong enough to get through the Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets and Brent Key's group. If you remember all the way back in the preseason, I did predict that game to be an upset for Miami. I did think that there was just a loss for Miami somewhere in a game that they were not going to expect to lose. That was a game coming in here that, okay, I mean, maybe you could see the upset, but a lot of people were picking Miami. The Cam Ward just wouldn't let that team lose all season long. Well, he let that team lose. And no, that is not me putting blame on Cam Ward. It is not Cam Ward's fault on why Miami lost that game to Georgia Tech just this past week. But now, guys, if you take a look at the ACC standings, this is where things start to get interesting, because it is SMU that controls their own destiny in the ACC right now, and Clemson and Miami are tied right there with one conference loss. Now, Clemson being the beneficiary of just playing one more conference game, they have one more conference win, and that in turn would put Clemson in the ACC championship game. But guys, right now, all the pressure in the world is on the Miami Hurricanes. SMU, they got no pressure whatsoever. Even if they lose one game here, which again, if you're SMU, you can likely just not afford to have happen, they're still probably going to win some tiebreakers and get into the ACC championship game. Clemson's got a tough one on the road against Pitt because they want to bounce back after those previous 2 losses. But again, you could see Pitt either bounce back in a big way, or you could see Pitt reel even more and Clemson goes on the road and kind of dominates them there. But besides the performance against Miami and besides the performance against Georgia, Clemson's been fantastic this year. Miami, again, they've had a lot of close games, but this has been one of the front runners in the entire nation this season. All of the pressure is on them. And they really, if you take a look at Miami's schedule, do not have one big key signature win. I mean, yeah, that road game against Louisville is going to look good. Louisville probably going to be ranked by the College Football Playoff Committee. In fact, I think they were last week. If not, then they're definitely going to be. They're at least ranked by the AP poll. So very well. That's Miami's best win right now. Clemson, no, never mind, because they lost to Louisville. Again, Clemson has sort of got that argument too. I mean, on the road against Pitt, sure, that would be a nice win if you can beat South Carolina. Sure, that would be a nice win. The SMU Mustangs, they're sitting right there, though. They got a win over Duke. Miami has that as well. They got a win over Pitt. They also have a win over Louisville when they were a ranked team, and their only loss being to a team in BYU that's the front runner of the Big 12 right now. The ACC is starting to get very, very interesting, but no one has more pressure in that conference than the Miami Hurricanes right now. Again, it's still looking pretty dicey if they can even get into the conference championship game. We'll see what happens down the line. Miami going to be favored in their final 2 games. I believe they play, yes, it's Wake Forest and then on the road against Syracuse, which don't discount that game in the Dome. Kyle McCord's been balling for the Orange this year. But yeah, Miami's got all the pressure, and very well, in order to sort of wipe their brow, they might need Clemson to lose one more game. But let's talk about the final power conference in the SEC. Don't look now. Guys, I think SEC Doomsday is starting to play out in front of our very eyes. Last week, I sort of talked about, hey, we could see Doomsday in the SEC. It was either last week, the week before, I don't remember, but I said, actually, no, now that I'm remembering it, I believe it was last week. But I did come out and say, guys, there's a scenario where the SEC now winds up, and I didn't say this specifically, but I'll say it now, winds up with an 8-way tie. Yes, an 8-way tie. And here is exactly how it had to happen. What had to happen last week happened. All the favorites won except Alabama beating LSU. In fact, they were even the favorite in that game, so that sort of falls in that category. And Alabama stomped LSU as the Tigers continue to not be able to defend the quarterback run this season. So with 3 losses, they're likely out of getting an at-large bid, but still in contention for an SEC championship because Ole Miss, I mean, they slaughtered Georgia. That was not just a upset win. They made a couple of extra plays. No, they controlled that game. They limited Carson Beck. They limited this Georgia run game. The offense did this offense was not super explosive, but this Georgia defense usually pretty darn good. But the Ole Miss pass rush, again, only provided 1 sack, but it came to life. It pressured Carson Beck. It forced a couple of picks, and Ole Miss suddenly right back in the thick of things as the college football playoff is concerned. SEC Doomsday is starting to take place. That is what needed to happen last week. You needed Alabama to beat LSU, and you needed Ole Miss to beat Georgia. And I'll explain what SEC Doomsday is here in just a little bit. But now this upcoming week, nothing really out of the ordinary. I mean, if you do want the coincidental 8-way tie, you're going to need Missouri to go on the road and beat South Carolina. You also are going to need Georgia to beat Tennessee. So the South Carolina right now, the heavy favorite over Georgia. South Carolina, the heavy favorite over Missouri right now. Georgia is the favorite over Tennessee as it currently stands. So that's what's got to happen next week. The following week in week 13, the only thing you need to have happen besides the favorites winning is you need Auburn to beat Texas A&M because that would give A&M their second conference loss. And then you move on to week 14. Besides all the favorites winning, you need Texas A&M to beat Texas. Now, what does all of that do? Well, it gives Tennessee, Texas A&M, Texas, Georgia, Ole Miss, Alabama, and LSU all 2 conference losses. And if Missouri is able to beat South Carolina, then you would include Missouri in that one. But again, I don't think Missouri's going to win any of the tiebreakers or anything that the SEC has put in place to make the conference championship game. But I'll read those things again. Tennessee, Texas A&M, Texas, Georgia, Ole Miss, Alabama, and LSU could all have 2 conference losses. And again, if Missouri's able to hold serve and they get a 10-win regular season, they would be included in that there as well. And then you have an 8-way tie for the SEC. I don't even know who would make the conference championship game then. I have not looked into it. I have not done the tiebreakers. I have not done the math, sort of figured out crunch the numbers per se. But you're going to need some of these teams to emerge. Right now, Tennessee, Texas A&M, and Texas, the only teams with 1 loss in SEC play, because no one is undefeated in SEC play this year. Tennessee, Texas A&M, and Texas all have 1 loss. I mean, Georgia can end that for Tennessee, and then Texas A&M and Texas, kind of like I said a couple weeks ago now, could very well, if everything holds serve and the favorites win out, that could be a play-in for who makes the SEC championship game, or heck, if things go a certain way, could be a rematch of the SEC championship game. There's so much left to work out within the SEC. It's absolutely crazy. But in order for the SEC doomsday scenario to start taking place, what had to happen last week happened. We'll see if we get what has to happen this week. Obviously, if Tennessee beats Georgia, then they're going to be in the front runnings, and it doesn't really matter about Missouri, South Carolina up to that point. But I guess if you want as less amount of teams to tie at the top of the leaderboard as possible, then you're probably going to want South Carolina to win that game and avoid sort of the epic doomsday scenario. It's still going to be doomsday whether Missouri's included or not if everything that I said earlier in this video happens. But to recap, Georgia beating Tennessee, and then if you want the 8-way tie, South Carolina to beat Missouri there as well. You need Texas A&M to lose to Auburn, and then Texas to lose to Texas A&M. That would give everybody in the SEC 2 conference losses, and then pick them. Really, at that point, I have no idea who would go make the conference championship game at that point. But this video has run way longer than my other takeaway videos, so I'm going to end it off here right now. Thank you all so much for watching. Remember to play hard but tailgate harder, and look out for my top 25 video coming out later today. Goodbye.